So thank you all so much for attending today's Instagram Live. It's a really interesting topic to cover. I think this is probably the first time that this text, the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa, is being covered on Instagram Live. And today's discussion was really going to be about introducing this particular text. But we're going to start off with talking about some of the issues and concerns that people have raised with regarding the authenticity of this text, and also some of the doubts and concerns that people have as to why this text can really be true, because there's information in this scripture that can be verified based upon our own histories in terms of what we learn in school, what you read, what's available online. And sometimes it's very difficult to believe when scripture becomes realistic, when information in the Vedic scriptures can be verified. This is a cause of concern for a lot of people because it's no longer a mythology, it's no longer a religious belief, but it's something which is directly interacting with the world that we know. It's something that we can perceive, it's something that we can relate to. And therefore there's been a lot of different opinions about the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa. So what I'm going to do is over the next 25 minutes, I'm going to pick out some of the key concerns that people raise on the authenticity of the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa. And then what I'll do, if we have time, I'll give a very quick overview on the introduction of the text firsthand. And then after that, I'll be happy to take some comments or questions that you may have thought of during the course of the first 25 minutes, or if there's anything spontaneous which you would like to share or you would like to ask, I'll be really happy to try to cover those depending on the amount of time we have left. We'll spend about half an hour on the questions once we've got started. Right. Okay, so let us begin. So the very first issue that people have with the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa, which is mentioned by a lot of scholars, both Western and Indian, is that the text is interpolated. Interpolated, what a term that hardly no one uses except when it comes to Vedic scriptures. I'm sure none of you have used this term on your WhatsApp messages to your friends or your families, or perhaps even at work, or essays for those who are studying GCSEs, A-levels, or other exams, depending on where you are in the world. But interpolated, it's the word which is synonymous with the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa. This text is interpolated. That is the claim. So what this basically means is that someone or people have gone into the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa and they've added information inside the text. And that has become part of the text that we know today. So therefore, it's no longer what we call a Purushaya. It's no longer of an origin which is non-human. It's now been contaminated by human touch. Because as you know, the Vedas are Apurushaya. Those texts that don't have a human origin, and therefore it's sacred. So this is the first argument. However, here is the response to the first argument: the text is interpolated. There exists no evidence of any named person who claims to have interpolated the text. There is also no record of how it was interpolated. So these are two main important arguments against the text being interpolated. To date, no one has claimed to have managed to do this in either one or across many of the temples, libraries, or gurukulas across India that preserve this scripture. And we'll come on to why these aspects are so important, because when Maharishi Vyasa documented the Vedic scriptures, he then established individual professors who became the heads of the various scriptures, who were then deputed to establish monasteries across the four compass directions of India to preserve the scripture. And this is quite elaborately explained in the 12th canto of the Bhagavatam. We'll give some examples of this a bit later on, but this is why I'm mentioning temples, libraries, and Vedic gurukuls. Also, to claim that the text was written retrospectively by colonialists during the British Raj or others is actually historically unsustainable. Why? Because there are no confessions. There are no documented colonial reduction programs. And there is no textual audit trail. All of these are missing in support of claiming the text to be interpolated. And also remember, any large-scale insertion within the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa text would require coordinated Sanskrit scholarship, pan-Indian manuscript replacement. There will have to be a whole strategy to replace the old manuscripts of the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa with the new one everywhere where the text is preserved. And also, in order to make sure that there's large-scale insertion within the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa, there would have to be a multiple traditional Vedic lineage silence. All of these are implausible. These are the reasons why it's not possible to accept that the text of the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa is interpolated. There is no evidence. No one claims to do so. There's no record. There's no audit trail. And there's no strategy that was implemented that could have possibly changed the text. Because remember, this text was distributed across all compass directions of India, as written in every single Purana. After Vyasadeva documented the scriptures, he then put this strategy in place to preserve the text. Number 2, the text of the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa is corrupted. This is the second claim that many people quite happily and quite proudly share online and perhaps in discussions as well. In response, the mathematical framework that's being utilized in the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa, which is basically 14,500 chandas. These are the metrical frameworks by which Vyasadeva expressed the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa in the form that we read today. If you count, there are 14,500 usages of chandas, and they are all intact. Not any verse in the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa has any signs of corruption. 14,500. Robust methods were adopted by Vyas to protect the Vedic scriptures. Therefore, any interpolation assumes that all the guardrails, the chanda, the metrical framework, the parampara, the individuals who were deputed to preserve the text. There's a specific parampara by which Maharishi Vyas passed on and distributed the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa. For example, we'll read a bit later on. It began from Lord Shiva to Lord Vishnu to Narad, Narad to Vyas, then Vyas spoke it to Samantu, and Sumantu then spoke it to a very particular king who is a descendant of the Pandavas. So we're going to read that in the first chapter of the introduction of the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa. So interpolation assumes that all the guardrails were broken and these were toppled by the someone. This someone who interpolated the text. This someone who corrupted the text that no one knows how, when, and who heavily edited the scripture. Therefore, for these reasons, we can't accept the claim of the text being interpolated or the text being corrupted. The Vedic scriptures are not a simple type of composition that any human can go and corrupt. Which is why when Lord Narayana, the scriptures explain, when he appeared at Krishna Dvaipayan, he implemented very robust methods to make sure that the words of the Vedas, the Vedic literatures, the Puranas, cannot be corrupted or interpolated. The third point is the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa is a fraud. However, what's interesting is, what some of you may not know, the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa is actually the most widely followed book by every Indian tradition. And I'll explain why. For those of you who celebrate Diwali, for those of you who celebrate Raksha Bandhan, for those of you who celebrate Rath Yatra, for those of you who celebrate Krishna Janmashtami, for those of you who observe the Ācāryas, the question is, where are these festivals documented? You may have asked this question to yourself as well. Where is the origin of the Diwali story in terms of the festival? Or Raksha Bandhan, for example. Many people in fact claim that Diwali and Raksha Bandhan are just cultural happenings that take place across Indian faiths, cultures. It's not true. The source text of the Ācāryas, of all of these festivals that I mentioned, in fact, there's about 3,000 Hindu, Indian, Vedic festivals and fasts that are documented in the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa. This is why this text, the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa, is actually followed by more than 1 billion people around the planet. If you observe any of these festivals, if you observe any of these vrats or fasts, please know for certain that they are documented and their origin is in the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa. So to assume the text is a fraud is absolute nonsense, because this is the text that is followed practically for nearly every festival and every fast that people conduct in Vedic culture. Number 4, many people say that the Ācāryas or the great saints have rejected the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa. What's interesting is no one has yet provided any proof of this. And instead, what you'll find is that the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa has actually been quoted by many Ācāryas in their commentaries, in their bhashyas, as a source of authority on multiple topics. As an example, Ācārya Madhva Ācārya, he quotes from the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa in his thematic commentary on the Mahabharata, called the Tatparya Nirnay. In the Gaudiya tradition, Rupa Goswami, he quotes from the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa in the Nectar of Devotion, the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu. Gopal Bhatta Goswami, he quotes from the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa in the Hari Bhakti Vilas, Sanatana Goswami too. Therefore, what you find is many Ācāryas, they actually quote from the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa, because why? This text is the source text on the fasts and the festivals that are followed. For example, Krishna Janmashtami, how to observe it, when to observe it, what the rules are. Raksha Bandhan, what is the mantra to recite when you're tying the thread on the hand, the wrist or the brother. The procedure, the hymns are all in the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa. In fact, it's about 8,250 verses that are dedicated on the fasts and the festivals that are to be followed across Indian Vedic cultures. And all of them originate in the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa. So therefore, the statement that the Ācāryas have rejected the text is not true. Number 5, this is an interesting one. So these points I'm sharing to you based upon comments that I've received and also comments that I've read about online and also in discussions. Number 5, the 5th most prominent popular criticism is that the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa promotes missionary motives to encourage Hindus or those of Vedic faiths to convert to other faiths. So this is actually a point that, quite honestly to tell you, many Hindus have actually thought that this is a genuine criticism, that the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa actually promotes the conversion to other faiths. However, the related verses in the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa do the exact opposite. If we, for example, look at the prediction of Jesus in the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa, King Shalivahan, at the end of his conversation with Jesus, he ordered the saint to remain in foreign countries to preach, quote unquote, Mlecha Dharma, and he did not permit him to come into Bharat. So this is how the story of, or the prediction of Jesus is concluded in the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa. It is not that King Shalivahan had anything against Jesus. It is the fact that the type of religion that he was promoting, and you'll have to go through the detail, and we'll definitely do that at some point, the type of religion that he was promoting was appropriate for mlechas, or for those who are outside of the Varnashram system, those who are outside the Vedic culture. And therefore the king quite naturally encouraged and permitted and promoted Jesus to continue providing his message to the appropriate circle of people outside of Ācāryas. Most people know that the Western group of people are popularly termed as Mlecha, a term for foreign people or people outside the Vedic culture or not belonging to the Varnashram system. So you will find that in all of the predictions of the West, this is the way in which the various predictions are made, that these are appropriate for individuals who are outside of the Vedic culture. So therefore the text cannot promote missionary motives to convert, because the text never supports these predictions to be relevant for those in Vedic traditions or cultural practices. Number 6, this is another interesting point, that the text of the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa is incomplete. However, it is a fact that if one manuscript has some pages missing, it doesn't mean that every manuscript will also have the same pages missing. And therefore, any missing pages in one manuscript are mitigated by manuscripts with no missing pages. And this is how modern publications, which are critical editions, were able then to publish the full version of the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa, because there were manuscripts that had no pages missing. Therefore, this is how we mitigate this particular criticism, that the text is incomplete. And what's also important to mention is that in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna actually makes a promise. He says, Dharma samsthapanarthaya. So in Sanskrit, some of you will know that arthaya is a dative grammatical ending for the word samsthapana. Sthapana means to establish. So Krishna says, to re-establish and to make sure that my words in the Vedic scriptures do not become lost or corrupted, he says, I appear. So therefore, according to the Gita, there is definitely someone watching over the sacred transmissions of Vedic texts. And this is why in the 4th chapter of the Gita, Krishna mentions that even the Bhagavad Gita, while it was spoken to Vivasvan, the sun, the Surya deity, many millions of years ago, Yogo Nashta Parantapa, the transmission of the Gita over time became lost. And therefore Krishna says, I have appeared again to re-establish the transmission of the Gita in society. So Krishna takes active role in making sure that the scriptures remain available for people who are interested in spiritual life based upon the views and the paths outlined in the Vedic culture. So this is also one reason why it's difficult to believe that the text of the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa is incomplete. It's not. You will find even today that the 14,500 verses of the text that are mentioned in nearly every other Purana is true, because the Bhaviṣya Purāṇa contains that many number of verses.